All right, I was thinking about the problem of evil again recently, and it's always tremendously difficult to conceptualize and talk about properly. So I'll see what success I have today. I was struck by an article, I think it was written by Michael Tooley for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, uh, that talked about how theists need to believe that evils are justified because they are logically necessary for goods that outweigh them. And the more that I think about that, the more I think that's certainly correct. Um, by way of contrast or rejoinder, I am reminded of David Bentley Hart's amazing "The Doors of the Sea," which eschews any theodicy, because it says theodicies essentially cheapen our doctrine of God, and they make God dependent on evil in some way. And that, when faced with the evil of, say, the Indonesian tsunami of 2018, it's better not to speak of any kind of uh, higher purpose or design or providence in such events, since Christianity is first and foremost a religion of salvation and of rescue. Um, I think that it's tremendous writing, and it's certainly tone deaf to go talking about the redemptive uh, purposes in events like that. Um, but there is the logical force behind Tooley's statements too, and I don't know if he actually does it like this, but it's pretty easy to see what he's talking about when you think about it. Um, so this is what I'm going to say, sort of on Tooley's side, who's an atheist, by the way, but he's studied the problem of evil. Um, I'm going to say this sort of by way of affirming uh, Tooley and rejecting Hart. Um, I'm going to start by sort of playing devil's advocate. I'm going to take an assumption for reductio. I'm going to show why theism basically is committed to the view that uh, evils are justified because they are logically necessary for goods that outweigh them. So let me assume, for the sake of argument, classical argument from evil. Was it Epicurus? God is all good and all powerful, but evil exists. Therefore, God must not exist. The theist is going to come back and say, "Wait, that's too fast. Um, Evil exists because there is free will." And what's interesting is in The Doors of the Sea, it's not really clear if Hart means this. It's never terribly clear what Hart means in that book. But there is this sort of insinuation that the reason why tsunamis happen is that the principalities and powers, the archons, we might even imagine panpsychic patterns of disorder and chaos that reign in our present age or world or dispensation, that these have been given a certain measure of free will, and that with that free will they have gone rogue, and it is from these reigning principalities and powers that God intends to rescue us. But even if we make the problem of evil fundamentally a problem of what moral agents choose to do with free will, um, and neglect natural evil entirely, and sort of refuse to see any of the problem as accounted for by, say, coincidence or blind mischance, which they're not really easily accounted for in a theistic picture of reality anyway. It doesn't really matter though for the problem of evil, because it, as we'll see, the first choice point when free will is invoked as a sort of theodicy, the first choice point is it logically possible that that creatures should have free will, but that no evil should exist? If the answer to this is no, then the theist is committed to the following view: that God is all powerful and all good, but evil exists. The reason why evil exists is that creatures have free will, and if creatures have free will, then of logical necessity, evil must exist. But evil is justified because it is logically necessary for a good, namely free will, that outweighs it. And then that's the position that the theist has to hold. Now, of course, for most people, myself included, it's like prima facie, it doesn't seem logically necessary that a free being must sin. And Hart himself brings up the figure of Christ, who is fully human and fully free, but fully sinless. And so, it might be here observed that evil is made possible by free will, but it is not necessitated by free will. So now there are other choice points that reveal themselves at this point in the flow chart. So remember, I'm the atheist. I'm the devil's advocate. I say that it's possible to have a world with free will but no evil. But that's not our world. If God existed, that would be our world. Therefore, God does not exist. So now there are a couple of options. One might be, well, somehow for reasons that can't or won't be explained, yes, there could be a world with free will but no evil, but that world just wouldn't be as, for lack of a better term, interesting as ours. But if that is the response given by the theist, then again, we are left in the position of saying that evils exist, but they are justified because they are logically necessary for goods that outweigh them. In this case, the claim is that evil is logically necessary for a more interesting world, a world with more, action and explosions, more stuff going on. As they say, nothing ventured, nothing gained. There is a world where perhaps everyone has a mild and sweet nature, but it's not very interesting to live in. So God created this world where people have much nastier natures because he thought that the overall picture was more interesting, shall we say. Doesn't really matter. The point being, the point is that if you think that a world with free will but no evil is possible, but still not as good as this, you are effectively affirming Thully's formula. Because if you ever said that, look, there's a world that's just as good as ours, and it still has free will, but it doesn't have any evil, or it doesn't have as much, then what reason is there for that world not to exist? There is almost more than God's goodness that is at issue here. There is the principle of sufficient reason. Namely, if something has no reason to exist, if God exists and this world, which is not as good, all else equal, as some other world, exists, then there's no reason for this world to exist, no reason for it to have been determined or selected from its complement, discriminated from its complement, created from nothing, by God, and however you conceive his creative action. If you conceive it as a classical theist does, as like pure act, or you conceive it as a somewhat invidiously a theistic personalist does, as like this kind of elaborative decision-making, anthropomorphic, game theoretic deliberation. It doesn't really matter. You're always in the position of saying that if there's something about this world that appears to be bad, it's in order that some greater good can obtain. Whether or not one claims to know what that good is, one has to affirm that it is at least made possible by the evil in our world, and therefore justifies the evil in our world. Now, at this point, an actual atheist can say, this is all so much the worse for theism, because the theist is committed to the view that evils are justified by goods for which they are logically necessary, but which outweigh them. But there's no realistic or plausible way to make sense of how the evils in our world could be logically necessary for goods that outweigh them. For me, this gets into the way that the problem evil has of becoming sort of inevaluable. I sincerely think now that even as an atheist, if I knew what I now know about the problem, I would sort of consider it basically inevaluable. It almost cannot be understood. It is so resistant to conceptualization. Let me begin to explain what I mean by this. It seems to me that predicates like good are defined on their complement, at least as a starting point, at least from the standpoint of just ordinary propositional logic, our ordinary analysis of our experience. Good is defined on its complement. If there is good, then there is not good. If there was not the analytic or logical possibility of not good, then good would have no meaning and could not be experienced as good. The mind is a meaning-making system. The psyche, the soul, consciousness, whatever you care to call it, it is a language, a self-configuring, self-processing language, even, to invoke Langen. It is a language. Languages require they require discrimination in order for there to be identities and predicates. I cannot make sense of a life that is only positive experiences. If the experiences are positive, then what are they understood in contrast to? I mean, is it possible, for example, to take someone's life and simply drain the negativity out of the negative experiences they had and leave the positive emotion in? Like, I lived my life, and every time I ate ice cream, it tasted, just as good. But when bad things happened, like my wife left me, it didn't. There was just no negative emotion there. I somehow didn't behave differently. I still behaved as though I were feeling awful, but really I wasn't. But see, the thing is, if you took the negative emotion out in such a way that it actually influenced behavior, or the lack of negative emotion actually influenced behavior, you would get different behaviors. And then the question is, in that picture of apathy, is it possible that the apathy would remain totally asymmetric? There would still be emotional involvement in positively valenced activities, but the negative ones, we can try to understand this with reference to something like hypomania. In hypomania, there is still the experience of things not happening as one expected. Now, that may itself, in one's buoyant mood, cause one to take a certain kind of delight. but there is still the category of things not being as expected, not going according to plan. And moreover, it's sort of artificial to imagine that hypomania could be the entirety of one's existence, because in reality, hypomania is part of a larger tapestry of experiences in which, even if only in memory, negative emotions figure. And as we go into like the higher forms of mania, they often do have pronounced dysphoric elements, especially in the so-called mixed state. But even just in the higher states, the agitation is there. It's a stick that is very much behind the dangled carrot, if one does not manage to achieve the goals toward which one is being driven in these manic states. People flip out and become angry. They overturn tables and throw glass plates and so on. And the question is, can we imagine phenomenologically that while this is happening, they're happy? It's kind of nuts. I mean, I would just like to see somebody really think about what it would mean for someone to only have positive experiences, assuming that that's possible. So I think realistically what we're left with is a picture in which, yes, there must be some negative emotion. There must be disappointment. The only question is how much and in response to what? And this is where it gets extremely difficult to say what would have been a better life and what would have been a worse life. I mean, within certain limits. Now, if you take somebody like Sam Harris, who says, well, it's not really so hard to make this call. Like, for example, if you're a child soldier in Congo, and all you know is fear and violence and coercion, and you're deprived of a normal childhood, that's not as good as if you are like Ben Affleck and you get to go to, like an Ivy League school and you get all this professional recognition. So it's like, okay, so the challenge is you don't have to make the child soldier's life perfect. You just have to make it not the life of a child soldier. But here, I think we should sense, not in any way to morally justify what happens there, and not in any way to fail to hope and pray earnestly for God to wipe away the tears of those people. But we do appreciate how, or we should appreciate how events are interrelated. That you can't really, or it's not really as simple as going into the life of one person and changing things up without having to change all the rest of the world in response. The world is going to be a tapestry, and it has to be seamless. You can't really just take certain stitches out and leave nothing, and leave the rest unchanged. It doesn't really work like that. It has to be a coherent overall picture. It can't have glitches, as we might say. It can't have things that are both here and there at the same time, in the same sense. So now the question is, can God have done everything more or less the same, or come up with a world that's equally good, but which on balance has like at least one less child soldier in it? That's the kind of question, like, who can evaluate that question? Every time that we wish for a better world, we can wish for it as a thumbnail sketch or in the abstract, but if we really had to design that world piece by piece by piece and say how everything fit together, no one could do it. So, really, I'm not saying that this means it's impossible, but I'm just saying that it's far from demonstrated that it is possible to improve on God's handiwork effectively. So when I think about evils being justified by goods for which they are logically necessary, but which outweigh them ultimately, I think about the good of having a seamless world, a world that it doesn't have glitches, it doesn't have contradictions, it has regularities that make it intelligible. Perhaps evil is, in some cases or to some degree, an entailment of that good. Relatedly, it may be that evil is an entailment or implication of creaturely freedom, without which life would not be worth living. Really, for me, the notion of an existence that was devoid of what you might at least compatibilistically call freedom or describe as freedom, to me, it's inconceivable that existence could be without agents that have their own will. But that's arguably neither here nor there for present purposes. And then finally you have the possibility that that let's say that an evil is truly logically necessary for the good that outweighs it. And that would be the case where the good that one experiences is inseparably connected to this event, as a matter of of logical necessity. It's not that contingently these two things happen to be related in history, but conceivably they could have happened separately from each other. Let me find a concrete example in order to make this point a little clearer. Let's take the Revolutionary War, for example. There was bloodshed, there was suffering, but arguably the resultant good of a free democracy that came out of it, or democratic republic, it outweighed the violence and the suffering. And in our history, you can't have had one without the other. You can't have had that freedom and that that new country based on democratic principles, etc., without the bloody war that preceded it. But logically, conceivably, no, it is possible that you could have had. So I'm saying as a matter of historical contingency, no, it's not conceivable. As a matter of logical possibility, it is conceivable that the United States could have been formed without a bloody war. For example, alternate world, 1776, the Declaration of Independence and the Crown answers, oh, okay, all right, we won't fight you over it. You guys just do your thing. So that's what I'm saying. If there was, let's say, the good that is truly, the good for which the Declaration of Independence is truly logically necessary, is the good that is inseparably bound up with it, as a matter of analyticity, as a matter of definitions. So, let's say, by 1776, I mean the Revolutionary War, I should have said. So let's take that war, and let's say that someone fought that war, and in it, they experienced tremendous despair, misery, but they also found the limits of their endurance, and then transcended or overcame them, and they really discovered who they are, say a soldier in the Revolutionary War. And for them, the war was a net positive. That's not a lot of people's experience of war, but it does appear to be some people's experience of it. And so, so the resultant character growth of that war would not have been possible without the war. That's what I'm talking about. And so, spiritually speaking, one can imagine that there are, that if you experience something that seems unendurable, and then find that you can endure it, or if you experience a set of circumstances that is so terrible that it seems to you that nothing could ever justify it, and then God shows you something of such beauty that it does, then God also shows you that the limits, that what you thought were the limits of your experience are not the limits of your experience or your endurance. And he shows you that life is better than you could have previously dreamed or conceived, because the goodness of existence shatters what you took to be a final or unsurpassable limit. In the religion that I was raised in, it's always stressed how everything is temporary, everything material is temporary. That is, everything that is not God is temporary. And, either in its duration or in one's appreciation for it. So if one becomes attached to something, one is going to lose it. That's sort of what I think George MacDonald had in mind when he said that it's a law of reality that whatever can be destroyed will be destroyed. So it's not inconceivable to me that God might give us certain goods effectively by showing us that what we thought was an attachment that we couldn't live without is actually something that we can live without. It brings C.S. Lewis to mind in A Grief Observed, where he says, "Lord, consider how strange you seem to us. What if I said to the boys, now, you can't have any toffee, but when you're older and don't care much for toffee, then you can have as much as you want. Consider how strange that would be, Lord, and consider how much you sound like that to me right now." But at this point, effectively, God would or could say, just shut up about the dang toffee. It was never about the toffee. I want to show you that existence is about more than toffee. That whatever you take to be the height or limit or apogee of your identity is still not your identity. Your identity is infinite, like mine. Now, granted, I know it seems a little perverse to say, how to put it? Look, you had this good thing, and then God took it away. But God's taking it away wasn't bad. It was good, because unless God took it away from you and showed you that you could live without it, it wouldn't be possible for you to survive the ordeal of being deprived of a certain good, of that particular good. This justification that I'm offering sort of begs the question. It says, it begs the question of why God had to ever take it away. It assumes that he should have. Well, again, what I said earlier about non-God things and being in their nature temporary. So it's not a question of whether you'll lose it, but only a question of when. It is a deep truth, I think, a terrible truth, but that whatever God gives you, you have to give it back to him. God gave Abraham a son, and then Abraham was ready to give his son back to God. God has given you your life, and you have to give it back up to God, because whoever clings to his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life will find it. That's the nature of reality, it seems to me. Now, here's an interesting question. Can one speak of good where whatever God does would seem to be good? Like Wittgenstein said, if you can't talk about wrong, then that just means you can't talk about right either. What does it mean to say God is good or that creation is good if whatever happens is by definition good? He's like, I get a good thing, I keep it, that's good. I get a good thing, I lose it, apparently that's also good. So I'm going to say more about the way in which good and evil appear to be of a piece. And again, yes, what I would stress is the inevaluability of the problem of evil. I'm not saying that the challenge that I just laid out is insuperable. I want to just go over some ideas that I think are relevant to the question that I just laid out. Namely, like questioning the apparently tautological nature of God's goodness, where it's like heads God wins and tails Satan loses, or something like that. Oh, by the way, I should point out that the clips that I'm about to share are from a Signal conversation with Jason, Mitch, and Luke Thompson, among other people. So If it sounds like I'm responding to someone else, essentially, it's because I am. Okay, these are some thoughts that I've had on the problem of evil. That I was thinking about them when I was sick, and I kept trying to share them, but things kept coming up. I think I have about 10 minutes until the announcement, so I'm going to try again right now. I was listening to Eleanor Stump on the problem of evil, and she had an interesting formulation of evil. I don't think it's original to her, though. She said that evil is non-being, but specifically, evil is non-being where being ought to be. So sometimes non-being is okay, but sometimes it's not. Is I guess the implication. And I thought that that was a pretty cool little formulation. Um, I also was reading the article on the problem of evil by Michael Tooley, I want to say is his name, on Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And in that article, there was a phrase that talked about how the problem of evil is evaded um, in just the case where evil, existent evil, is found to be the logically necessary precursor to a good which outweighs it. Something like that. I'm paraphrasing. Um, and that's a very interesting phrase, and I've been thinking about that a lot because often in thinking about the problem of evil, I have had this sense, almost like God is telling me, it's like you want to evaluate the worth of my creation by reference to what might have been, i.e., to what is not. But I simply never look away from my creation at all. So like that's this kind of felt sense or intuition I've had when thinking about the problem of evil. It's like almost like God is saying that. And so, it's like logically necessary for goods that outweigh them. There's two aspects here. I'm going to take the goods that outweigh them aspect first. We have a tendency to really see things in terms of absolutes. Like we just rank order goods on this absolute scale, good, better, best. But really, whether something is good or bad, it's kind of like the Chinese farmer problem. Is that good? Is that bad? Is that good? It very much depends. I mean, it absolutely depends. It's absolutely relativized to some higher standard of good, which ultimately is God. So like there's this other principle that I have in mind, which is like this. The ultimacy of ultimate reality is such that any reality is ultimately ultimate reality. So there's this sense here that the problem of evil is so difficult because God's creation is not simply something to be hung in the balance and judged either good or bad. Ultimately, God's creation is convertible with himself in a deep sense, and therefore God's creation is the very standard by which we would judge something good or bad, as well as the thing to be weighed in the balance, as well as the item to be judged. Um, and so it's a very tricky aspect of the problem of evil. Um, the logically necessary, that part of the formulation, it's logically necessary. If you say that, say the good that outweighs the evil of the Holocaust is some contingent circumstance, such as, for example, as I think some Jews actually believe, although I'm really not trying to use this. I can't speak for anyone, but I shouldn't have said that. But you know, people do point out a sort of silver lining that for the Jewish people it was good that the state of Israel in some way resulted from the Holocaust. Although again, that's tremendously controversial. I maybe shouldn't have used it as an example. But let's use it as a hypothetical example. Let's say that's the only way. Well, let's say that that's how it happened in history. That because the Holocaust happened, the state of Israel happened, and let's assume, or let's contend for the sake of argument, that the state of Israel is justifying the Holocaust. The issue here is when we say something is logically necessary for a good that outweighed it, it means that logical necessity means that it couldn't conceivably have been otherwise. In other words, it's saying that the state of Israel could not have conceivably resulted apart from the Holocaust. But that's not a true statement, because we can imagine the state of Israel could have existed, or could have come into existence again, despite there not having been a Holocaust. So logically necessary for goods that outweigh them. Logically necessary means that it is logically necessary for some good that truly only could have resulted from the Holocaust. It must be something that, it must be that experiencing the Holocaust discloses something about the infinite nature of ultimate reality that can only have been revealed through that experience. And so I think, to me, it's hinting at the way in which suffering is not set equal to something else, but is itself set equal to something else that justifies it, but is itself actually transmuted, almost through alchemy. It's transmuted into an inexpressibly heavy or weighty glory. And so those are some thoughts I had on the problem of evil as I was lying sick, and I think that it's pretty interesting. I mean, Luke's probably going to be like, yeah, duh, obviously. It's just like, it's all trivial to me. But I think that there's something there that I might want to hold on to in terms of thinking about the problem in the future. So like here's an example of creation being both the item to be weighed, but also the balance. When I think about the tremendous apparent waste and loss of life and savagery and pointlessness that deep history, the deep history of evolution and of the planet seem to disclose, I'm revolted. I think of all the suffering, and my empathy is sort of it's just overactivated is a stupid way to say it, but let's say that. And the thing about it though is that this matrix of evolution was the precondition for my empathy, my sense of empathy being formed in the way that it has, and for my values to come into being and be offended in precisely this way. And without that whole hideous process, I would not have this set of standards, this particular sensibility with which to judge it. This is an example of what I'm talking about. Is it good or is it bad? Cannot be said absolutely. It must await a judgment from some standard, and I think ultimately that standard is creation itself, but understood ultimately as ultimate reality. So that's maybe that doesn't make anything more clear, but that's it's part of the way that I approach the problem, part of the way that it discloses itself to me. So to sum up, creation has a way of not only being the thing hung in the balance, but also the very balance itself. It has a way of being both the evaluandum and the standard of evaluation. And, again, that ultimacy principle I talked about, where every reality is ultimately ultimate reality, this is just what you would expect of ultimate reality. That it would be sort of autotelic or self-judging in this way. It has this sort of inescapable reflexivity or recursion to it. It's like Jose Ortega y Gasset said, I am I in my circumstances, and you, as your circumstances, cannot escape yourself. This sort of deal. So to really sum up, have I made any kind of final sense of the problem of evil? No. I'm kind of resting my case on it being ultimately like just like impossible to even like wrap your mind around, really. As I said before, even as an atheist, if I knew then what I now think I know, I would just refrain from letting this be the issue on which God's existence is decided. So really for me, I go the other way and I say, there's tremendous evidence for God's existence, or tremendous philosophical argumentation, or what have you, whether you consider that evidence or whatever status that gets assigned. And then the problem of evil itself is a bit of a wash. Like, you can't make sense of it either way. You would have to already be God to know whether or not this reality is compatible with God's existence, really. And so I let the issue be decided on other matters. But again, as I said at the start of this episode, that if you are a theist, then you are essentially committed, I think, pretty clearly to the view that evils are justified because they are logically necessary for goods that outweigh them. I think we can know that much. Now, just exactly how they're justified and what exactly are the goods that outweigh them, I think that will await our death and resurrection, essentially. All right. Well, I thank you very much for listening, if you've listened this long, and I really hope to hear whatever feedback you might have, and I'll see you next time.